Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to talk about the character of Galadriel. In The Lord of the Rings we don't get a whole lot of detail about her, even in the appendices, and then she gets worked into the Silmarillion kind of retroactively in the published version that we have, but most of the information we have is not really what you might call canonical. There's a lot of information mostly available in the unfinished tales that fleshes out her history, and a lot of the information is really contradictory. It's a good showcase of how Tolkien would spend a lot of time developing ideas that came along and really change it over the course of time, and a lot of his developments contradict each other, and it's not really clear where exactly he intended things to end up all the time. So there's a lot of information. Let's go ahead and get started. There's a lot to get through, so this might be a little long, but it'll be interesting. To get started, for those of you who don't know, and to refresh those who have read the Silmarillion, in the very beginning of the elves' story, there are three basic kindreds. There are the Valinor, who are the ones who are have the most affinity with the Valar themselves. There are the Noldor, which is the ones that the Silmarillion is primarily concerned with, and there are the Teleri, who are the shipbuilding and music making variety. Most of the elves who never made it to Valinor are of the Telerin kindred. Now, Galadriel is primarily considered a Noldor, but she actually has all three kindreds in her lineage. The first king of the Noldor originally married another Noldorin elf, and their child was Feanor, the elf who created the Silmarils. In giving birth to Feanor, Finwë, the Noldorin king's wife, the Noldorin king, his wife died giving childbirth, so he then remarried a Vanyar elf. They had two more children together, one of them named Fingolfin, one of them named Finarfin. Finarfin ended up marrying a Telerin elf and they ended up having several children, many of them who ended up being fairly important in the Silmarillion, and one of them was Galadriel herself. So she has Vanyar kindred and Telerin kindred, even though she's primarily considered a Noldor. Now the interesting thing about that is the Vanyar are the kindred of elves that are mainly associated with having golden hair. Noldorin elves are mainly associated with having dark hair. Telerin elves have kind of a gray silvery hair. Now, Galadriel we tend to associate with having golden hair, but in the unfinished tales we actually get a little bit extra description that implies that, or even directly states, that her hair seemed to actually have a mixture of both gold and silver. And this kind of gets used in the unfinished tales materials to explain part of the reason that she's considered so amazingly beautiful. And the reason for that is the two trees of Valinor, which were the source of light before the sun and the moon, and indeed the source of the sun and moon themselves, gave off golden and silver light, each in their own turn. And according to the unfinished tales material, the saying among the elves was that her hair was so marvelously beautiful that they kind of considered that it had caught the mixed light of the two trees in her hair. So it was considered kind of a marvelous thing even among the elves, who were of course supernaturally beautiful by human standards. So there's already that going for her. The other interesting things that Tolkien tells us in some of these unpublished, or not canonically published, I guess I could say, materials, is that she has not only great wisdom for a Noldor, but also great strength. I mean, physically speaking, it says that she is a match for even the athletes of the Noldor, and that she's abnormally tall. So she's kind of a very interesting person in the sense that she has really, really preternatural gifts, even for an elf, and it says that she is considered the greatest of the Noldor, except perhaps Feanor himself, which Feanor, of course, is considered definitely the greatest craftsman of the Noldor, but he's not just a great craftsman. He also has many other gifts in terms of insight and whatnot. Other things that we learn about her early attributes and talents, her main wisdom, I guess, is the ability to kind of perceive the thoughts of others, to kind of not read their minds per se, but you kind of get that idea in the Lord of the Rings movies, but to kind of perceive what their inner thinking is. And that comes into play a lot into the way that her character is developed in a lot of these Unfinished Tales materials. So that's kind of a background on like her early life and her basic talents. And then now I want to move into how that kind of plays into her role in the early stages of Valinor and the Silmarillion. And here's where it starts getting really contradictory in terms of what the sources say. Some of the earliest interactions that Galadriel has with the main characters in the Silmarillion drama are with Feanor and Melkor, or Morgoth, themselves. And her perceptiveness is kind of what leads her to never really side with Morgoth or Feanor. And that's one of the few consistent things in the entire Galadriel tradition, is that she's never on the same side as Feanor. Some of the other aspects of that change, but never that particular element. And this kind of plays out in a couple of ways. First of all, whenever Melkor starts trying to spread lies and get the elves to rebel against the Valar, she never falls for that. Although, like everybody else, she is slightly poisoned by his lies to some degree. Now, there is a variant of the story where that's not even really the case, because there's one variant of the story where early on she moves to live with the Teleri and marries Celeborn there, which is strange because in almost all the other sources, and indeed the Silmarillion itself, Celeborn never made it to Valinor. He was born in Middle-earth as a relative of the other Telerin elves who were, never left Middle-earth at all. So that's kind of a weird little lacuna that I don't know if Tolkien intended to change things or what, because of course the Silmarillion that we have was not really the finished product. It's just what Christopher Tolkien could put together from finished narratives that were available. So it's not really clear where that was intended to end up. Regardless, Galadriel rejected Morgoth in all but but was poisoned by his lies in all but basically one version of the story. And Feanor, for his part, one of the things that is said in the Unfinished Tales is that he got the idea to create the Silmarils from Galadriel's hair, this idea of catching the light of both of the trees. And he asked her for a tress of her hair on 3 different occasions, but she rejected him each time. And part of that is based on the fact that she saw in Feanor, who in some way was the most corrupted by Melkor's lies, and frankly his personality itself was also just kind of already a little bit on the not so healthy side. She kind of saw in him a darkness that she was worried about, not recognizing that she herself and others were also poisoned with the same kind of lies, but in Feanor it really took more root than in most. So, at any rate, no matter what version of the story you read, she's always hostile to Feanor in some sense. Now, the way that plays out depends on which version of the story you read. Like I said, in one version of the story, she moved to live with the Telerin elves fairly early on. In that version of the story, she's actually planning to go to Middle-earth regardless of any of the other things that go on, basically because by that point she's reached the stage where she doesn't feel like she can learn anymore from the Valar. She wants to kind of go out on her own, find a realm of her own in Middle-earth that she can kind of, like moving from a stage of being a learner to, mastering things on her own. So, and it indicates in there that maybe she would have been able to do that, but because of Feanor's rebellion, the Valar basically placed a ban on any elf leaving Valinor, and that's how she kind of ends up being on the wrong side of things because she was going to leave anyway, and she decided to do it for, again, depending on which version of the story you read, different reasons. In that version of the story, she basically decides to do it so that she can counteract Feanor in Middle-earth because she knows Feanor is leaving. In other versions of the story, she's mainly kind of caught up in Feanor's rebellion, but never on his side. In Feanor's move to leave leave Valinor for Middle-earth, he wants to go, of course, fight Morgoth and whatnot. The other elves who are mainly following Fingolfin are mainly following because they don't want the Noldor to be completely separated, and because many of them also do kind of want, like Galadriel, to have a realm of their own. They're feeling kind of cramped in Valinor. You have to remember the Noldor are the elves that are most keenly interested in learning, making, and that sort of thing. So they have this desire to go out and learn more and do things on their own. And Galadriel, like all the other Noldor, are basically strong-willed. So you've got all that going on. So there's a lot of reasons why Fingolfin and the other elves follow Feanor, even though they're not really rebelling against the Valar in the same way. And in most versions of the story, that's kind of where Galadriel is at. She's following along, but not really, because she's with Feanor. She's with the other batch of the elves. Now, the next interesting part of the story is when Feanor is trying to leave, he realizes he's not going to get to Middle-earth without ships. And the Telerin elves are the ones who have ships. They're the only ones that have ships because they live on the seashore. And so he basically goes and asks for the ships. The Teleri basically tell him no. And at that point, he decides to take them by force, and that starts the first slaying of elf by elf. And it becomes rather nasty. Now, in basically every variation of the story, Galadriel actually actively fights against him. The only place it doesn't really mention that is in the published Silmarillion itself, and even there we're told that she didn't take part in it. She wasn't part of Feanor's killing of the Telerin elves, but in most of the other versions, where in the Unfinished Tales it goes into more detail, she actually fights against him, but regardless, Feanor does end up with the ships, and he does leave with the ships for Middle-earth. Now again, depending on the version of the story, Galadriel follows along either with Fingolfin, or as in the one lone version where Celeborn is actually a Valinorian elf, she leaves with Celeborn on her own, basically, but in the other version she's with the host of Fingolfin and follows along. And at this point, basically all the stories say, except again the published Silmarillion, that she's following along into Middle-earth partially to kind of fight back against Feanor, because the Telerin elves were her kindred. She was part Telerin elf, whereas Feanor wasn't, so she has family connections to really want revenge against Feanor at this point. So her motives for going to Middle-earth, no matter which version you read, pretty much are complex and varied. They're not like most of the other elves, although she does share the same motives with them. So that's kind of where she enters Middle-earth. Now let's move into that stage of her history. So once in Middle-earth, Galadriel eventually moves to Doriath, which makes sense because Doriath is a Telerin kingdom. It's ruled by Elu Thingol, also known as Elwë, who was originally the king of the Telerin elves, but he stayed behind in Middle-earth. And she meets there, under virtually every version of the story, Celeborn, who is a fairly close relative of Thingol's. Thingol, of course, being the father of Luthien from the story of Beren and Luthien. At any rate, she meets Celeborn there, and for the most part, she doesn't really take part in most of the war against Morgoth. In the published, the Unfinished Tales materials, some of the stories indicate that she thought it was basically a hopeless endeavor and advocated for moving into the eastern part of Middle-earth, which is basically where the Lord of the Rings material happens, because Beleriand is to the west, and the Silmarillion, that all sinks at the end of the First Age. But she couldn't really get any of the other elves to go along with that, and so that didn't really go anywhere. But she with Celeborn eventually do move east, but it depends on which version of the story you read how that happens. Mainly you get the idea that they are in Doriath until it's destroyed by the dwarves who kill Thingol and steal the Silmaril. And I'll link to a video on the history of the Silmarils where I go into a little bit of that history for a little bit of background. And so that part of their history is pretty important, because if you read The Lord of the Rings, this doesn't really come up in the movies, but if you read The Lord of the Rings, when the Fellowship arrives in Lorien, Celeborn is kind of rude to Gimli. He's not very nice about the fact that they went through Moria and awoke the Balrog, and he kind of lays it at Gimli's feet. Galadriel kind of chides him, and he apologizes, but that kind of comes from the whole fact that his family and his original kingdom was destroyed by dwarves, and so he's not really a fan of dwarves. So that plays a pretty significant role in what follows next. Other than that, we don't really know much about Galadriel until the Second Age, and, well, the end of the First Age, I should say, because at the end of the First Age, Morgoth is defeated, many of the Noldorin elves are allowed to come back, and again, here's where some of it gets contradictory. Some versions of the story say that Galadriel was considered kind of a leader in the rebellion and therefore not allowed to come back. Other versions imply that she was allowed to come back but chose not to, and even there's a little bit of contradiction, because some of it says she didn't want to because she loved Celeborn and he didn't want to leave Middle-earth. Some of it was because she was too proud to accept the forgiveness offered, and some of it was just kind of she wanted to stay in Middle-earth herself. So again, there's mixed rationales going on, and again, it's not really clear exactly where Tolkien wanted it to end up. Regardless, she stays in Middle-earth with Celeborn, and what they do is they move into the region of Eriador in Middle-earth, which is where the Shire is, for a short period of time. They have, according to this one version of the story, they have a son, Amroth, which you may recognize if you've read The Lord of the Rings as the origin of Dol Amroth, which has a whole story behind that as well. In some other versions, Amroth has no connection to Celeborn and Galadriel at all in terms of, being a relative. So again, contradictions. Anyway, one way or the other, they have, according to this version of the story, their son Amroth. It's not really clear when they have their daughter. They end up having a daughter named Celebrian. She ends up being the wife of Elrond and the mother of Arwen. So Galadriel, therefore, is Arwen's grandmother. Interesting fact. So anyway, they moved to Eriador for a little while. Then they moved to Eregion, which is the main Noldorin kingdom in the Lord of the Rings part of Middle-earth that we're familiar with, other than Gil-galad's kingdom near the mountains of Lindon. So they set up this kingdom in Eregion, and again, there's a little bit of contradiction depending on which story you read, because in some stories, Celebrimbor, who is the main smith or craftsman of the elves in that area, came with them from the wreck of Beleriand. And then there's some versions that say he was kind of already the lord of the Eregion there, or he came there independently. And again, this is even within the same story. Tolkien kind of changed his ideas. Celebrimbor was either a smith who came out of Gondolin, or, as in the published Silmarillion, he was a grandson of Feanor through his son Curufin. So, and I mentioned that in the Silmarillion, the Silmaril history video that I'm going to link to below as well. So, there's a lot of very, very rapidly changing ideas throughout all this material, as you can see. Anyway, they set up this, or come into this kingdom of Eregion. Galadriel in this version of the story is in some sense looking to make an ally of the dwarves of Moria, because she recognizes that they're very good warriors and good for killing orcs, and she recognizes that there's still evil somewhere in the world, even though Sauron hasn't really manifested himself as a single evil bad guy entity yet. Celeborn, of course, is still kind of, I don't like dwarves. So at any rate, at some point, Sauron tries to influence Celebrimbor and the other smiths in Eregion. He succeeds. Galadriel kind of knows that he's not the best guy, but it doesn't go into a whole lot of detail there. And even depending on the version of the story, Celeborn and Galadriel are actually the Lord and Lady of Eregion, or Celebrimbor is. Not really clear, again, where that was supposed to end up, where he finally settled. But during that process, Celeborn and Galadriel either were not the Lord and Lady of Eregion, or to the extent that they were, Celebrimbor essentially rejected their headship of the realm, and basically they became kind of irrelevant. At that point, Galadriel moves through Moria to Lorien, which Lorien, or Lothlorien, was basically a realm of unruled, again, depending on which version of the story you read, either a bunch of gray elves that never left Middle-earth that just really didn't have a leader, or they already had a leader named Amroth. Again, depends on which version of the story you read, because in one, she actually brings her son Amroth with her to Lothlorien, and eventually leaves Lothlorien in his charge while she goes back and looks for Celeborn. Celeborn wouldn't pass through Khazad-dûm or Moria because he doesn't like dwarves. So she ends up being in Lothlorien at least for some time. Sauron makes his war in the Second Age to try to recover the rings, kills Celebrimbor and all that, but not before Celebrimbor managed to realize what Sauron was up to, give Galadriel one of the rings, and give the other two rings to Gil-galad in the west. So apparently during the attack by Sauron, Celeborn actually led the defense of Eregion, and that, just kind of a side note, but after the war was over, Galadriel came back across the mountains to find Celeborn, found him in Rivendell, where Elrond had basically set up his stronghold. It's not, we don't think of Rivendell as a stronghold, but that's essentially what it was originally, because it's in a kind of a fortified secret place. And there, Elrond meets Celebrian, and they fall in love. Eventually they marry, but it's not really made clear in any of the stories when that happens. So at any rate, according to this version of the story, Galadriel and Celeborn then move to the southern part of Middle-earth, where Dol Amroth eventually gets set up in the Kingdom of Gondor, while Amroth himself is still ruling Lothlorien, and then it's really unclear, which version of the story, but it says in this particular version that Galadriel and Celeborn really only moved back to Lothlorien fairly late in the history before Sauron starts to take shape again. So there's a lot of movement and a lot of vagueness in terms of where they're going, why they're going, who's leading Lothlorien, because in some versions it's Amroth has nothing to do with Celeborn and Galadriel. It just gets really murky in some of these places. So that brings us through the Second Age. Now let's look at, well, I should also mention, when they're in Rivendell, they also have the first meeting of the White Council, or at least a first council. It doesn't say White Council, although it's almost implied that that's kind of the origins of it. But that comes into play mainly in the Third Age, so let's move to that. So in the Third Age, Galadriel is mainly concerned with trying to keep Sauron from reasserting himself, and part of that is her participation in the White Council. Now the wizards don't show up in Middle-earth until about the year 1000 of the Third Age, so there's a lot of time that passes before they really come on the scene. Once they do, and the White Council starts meeting in earnest, we do know from the Lord of the Rings that Galadriel was in favor of Gandalf being the head of the council, and that's part of the reason that Saruman never really liked Gandalf. He was always a little bit jealous. That kind of an interesting aside, but it's worth noting because it's a major aspect of Galadriel's character. She kind of saw, and again this goes back to her perceptiveness, that Gandalf was really the best of them. So that's that. And then the other things that go on are we don't really know a whole lot of the details, but of course we come to the Lord of the Rings, and we meet her in Lothlorien when the Fellowship arrived there. And in the book and the movie, the way it happens is a little bit different, but basically the same. The idea that she's kind of reading their minds again, that goes to the perceptiveness again, and each one of them feels like they're kind of being questioned. And in the movie, they kind of act like Aragorn is totally clueless and doesn't get it and acts surprised when Boromir mentions this, but I think in the book, pretty much everybody feels the same thing. And then, of course, she goes to the gift giving. This is one of the more interesting parts of the novel, really, because, and even in the movies, it's pretty interesting, but in the novel, the gifts are much different. There's several differences between, but the one I want to focus on is the gift to Gimli, of course. Gimli, and I love the conversation between Gimli and Galadriel, because it's hyper etiquette, for lack of a better term, because Gimli is in such awe of Galadriel that he doesn't even want to ask for a gift, but she tells him to name one, and he names it, and he says, you know, I'm not asking for it, but you did tell me to name one. He asks, of course, for a strand of her hair, and she gives him 3. Now, going back, if you remember at the beginning of the video, or near the beginning of the video, Feanor asked her 3 times for a tress of her hair. So there's an interesting parallel here where she's kind of, in a way, you know, showing that she's become a little more humble and a little more, I don't know, I mean, it's just interesting because, again, she denied Feanor for other reasons, but it's still an interesting parallel because it shows that, she's, even though her kindred were also killed by dwarves in Doriath, she's still wise enough and good enough to realize that not all dwarves are bad guys, and Gimli's, you know, he's one of the good ones. So that's an interesting thing in and of itself. So you've got that, and then the other thing that's really not pointed out in the movies, and in the movies, in fact, it even implies the opposite, because she tells Aragorn that we won't meet again, or something to that effect. In fact, she goes to Aragorn's wedding with Arwen, which of course makes sense. Arwen is her granddaughter. Why wouldn't she go and see her granddaughter get married? So that's just a little interesting side note. But, and after that, they're actually, Celeborn and Galadriel are actually part of the party that leaves Minas Tirith with Frodo and the rest of the Fellowship who aren't staying in Gondor. And they travel with them at least all the way to Isengard. I don't remember exactly. I think it's at Isengard that they basically part, because they go back to Lothlorien before they basically get cut off by the Misty Mountains, whereas Frodo and Gandalf and the other hobbits continue westward toward the Shire. So that's really the last thing that happens with Celeborn and Galadriel until they depart for Middle-earth. Now, interestingly enough, in the movie, we see Galadriel and Celeborn leaving together, but the indications in the written story are that Galadriel left by herself, and then Celeborn followed later because he basically realized, man, life's just not as good as it was. Another interesting thing to note, just in terms of all that, in some of the Unfinished Tales materials, it indicates that when she was given the ring, Ninya, it actually increased the desire for the sea in her, which, being a Tellarran elf, was, you know, already there. All elves really have some desire for the sea, but the Tellarri even more so. So it made that even stronger. So she really, once the power of Ninya was destroyed with the One Ring being destroyed, Lothlorien was no longer quite the image of Valinor that it was under the power of Ninya. So eventually that's just kind of, she realizes there's nothing left here, it's time to go back to Valinor. And even in those terms, it's worth noting, again, this idea that either she wasn't allowed or chose not to go back to Valinor whenever the First Age ended. In The Lord of the Rings, there's some indication that she at least thought she wasn't allowed to go back, and there's some indication that she was hoping that Frodo would be allowed to go back in her stead, kind of as her own, not really a sacrifice on her part since she didn't think she could go back, but just for Frodo's sake. But there's also the fact that when she does go back, in some versions of the stories, there's an implication that the reason she finally does get to go back is because she rejects the ring when Frodo offers it. Because for a lot of her history, again, depending on which version of the stories you read, she's interested in kind of ruling her own realm and having, not tyrannical power per se, but, being in charge. And so when she's offered that ring and rejects it, even though, as she admits, her heart has greatly desired it, it's kind of like that final proof of, okay, you really have reformed. You've, grown in wisdom to the point that you realize, you've got your priorities straight. We'll let you come back now. So, again, it depends on which version of the story you read, like so much of Galadriel's history, but it's worth pointing out. So that point in the story where Frodo offers the ring and she rejects it is, depending on which version of the story you read, a really crucial point in her own personal development and history. So that is the character of Galadriel. Like I said, there's a lot to it, mainly because of all the contradictions you have to explore, but I think it's well worth reviewing, and it makes her an interesting character because when you get all of it together and kind of piece it all together, you do get a pretty consistent image of somebody who was originally proud, self-willed, even if she did have a lot of her own native wisdom, but over time learns humility and repentance, and that, that's an interesting theme for Tolkien's work, because it's not one that you see very much. Most of the good guys just kind of are good guys for the whole thing, except the Silmarillion. There's a lot of need for repentance in the Silmarillion, but the Lord of the Rings, there's not really a whole lot of that going on, and so Galadriel is the main vehicle through which that theme enters the story. So that's why I think it's really worth looking into her history in detail. And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed learning about Galadriel's very conflicting history in the Unfinished Tales and Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion, for what it's worth. It's a really good exercise in seeing how Tolkien's mind worked in terms of developing things that he had these ideas and he just kept changing them and changing them and changing them, never really settling on a final version for the most part. And it's complicated. I mean, Christopher Tolkien in the Unfinished Tales actually says that no single story in the entire Middle-earth universe is more full of contradictions from the extant materials than the story of Celeborn and Galadriel. So, I mean, there's a lot going on there. Really interesting stuff. If you did like the video, please do give it a like. Please also subscribe to the channel if you want to learn more about Tolkien and the worlds he created. Or you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.